Montana Territory, December 1873. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the open plains, and when Xander Oakes spotted the figure collapsed in the snowbank, he thought at first he was seeing a ghost. He reined in his Appaloosa hard, snow kicking up around the horse's hooves. The woman lay half-buried, her bonnet iced over, her coat stiff with frost. He swung down and dropped to his knees beside her. "Ma'am!" His voice was hoarse from the cold. He touched her cheek, it was like ice. "Come on now. Stay with me." Her lips moved, barely. "Darling," she whispered, though her eyes didn't open. Xander didn't ask questions. He wrapped her in his buffalo hide coat, lifted her limp body into the saddle, then climbed up behind her, holding her tight. His cabin was a half-mile west, tucked under a ridge. He kicked the horse into a trot and prayed she would not die before they got there. She came to on his cot, fire crackling nearby. Her eyelids fluttered and she looked around like she was surprised to still be alive. Then her gaze landed on him. You are not Mr. Alden," she said, her voice rough like gravel. Xander sat back in the chair, elbows on his knees. "No, ma'am. Name's Xander Oakes. You were near froze when I found you. About a mile from here." She blinked slowly, then sat up with effort. "I was supposed to meet Mr. Alden at the station in Fort Benton. He sent for me. I was to be his wife." Xander's jaw tightened. "Station's a full day's ride south. What the hell were you doing out here?" "I do not know." Her hands trembled in her lap. "The coach broke down. The driver said we were close enough to walk. Then the storm hit. I must have wandered the wrong way." Xander stood and dropped another log on the fire. "You are lucky you did. Another hour out there, you would not have made it." She nodded, silent. "What is your name?" he asked. "Delia Carrigan." She looked down at her hands. "From Ohio." Xander studied her. She had dark hair, messy and wet from where he had cut the ice from it, and pale skin that was starting to show color again. She looked young, maybe 22, 23. Not a child, but not hardened by this land either. He crossed his arms. "Delia, I do not know this Alden fellow. But if he sent for you and left you to die in a snowstorm, he is not the kind of man you want to marry." She looked up at him then, eyes full of something raw. "I do not have a choice. I sold everything to make this journey. I have nothing left." Xander looked away, jaw clenched. He knew that kind of desperation. He had seen it in his mother's eyes before his father died. "Well," he said, "you are not going anywhere today. Or tomorrow. You stay here until the weather clears. We will figure it out after that." The storm lasted 4 days. In that time, Delia moved from cot to table, helping where she could. She cooked simple meals with his salted meat and beans, folded his laundry with practiced hands, and swept the floor without being asked. Xander watched her. She never complained. Not once. On the second night, she asked, "Are you married, Mr. Oakes?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not anymore." She nodded, waiting. "My wife died 5 winters ago. Fever took her and our boy. Just me now." Delia looked down at her cup. "I am sorry." He shrugged, but the pain never really left. Some things just happen. By the 4th morning, the light broke through the clouds and the snow started to melt in patches off the roof. Delia stood by the window. "I suppose I should go find Mr. Alden." Xander stood across the room, arms crossed. "You still want to marry a man who left you to freeze?" She turned slowly. "I do not want to marry a man like that. But I cannot go home. There is no home left." He nodded once, jaw tight. Then he crossed the room and looked her in the eyes. "Then marry me." Her breath caught. "What?" "I am not fancy. I do not have much. But I have land and a roof and food. And I would never leave you to die in the snow." She stared at him, unsure. "I will not force you," he said quietly. "But I mean it. You need a name and safety. I need someone with a heart like yours." Delia swallowed hard. "You do not even know me. I know what kind of woman bakes bread with frozen fingers and sweeps a floor that is not hers. That is enough." She stepped closer. What if I say yes? Then I will ride to Fort Benton when the road clears, bring back a preacher, and give you my last name proper." Her eyes filled with tears then, and she nodded once, just once, and said, All right. 3 days later, the road was passable again. Xander rode to town and returned with an old preacher and 2 witnesses from the nearby ranch. Delia wore a borrowed dress from one of the ranch wives, her hair brushed smooth. Her cheeks were pink with cold and nerves. Xander held her hands as the preacher spoke the vows. She said, "I do," with a steady voice. When it was his turn, Xander looked her in the eye and said, "I do," like it was the first true thing he had said in 5 years. They signed the paper, Delia Carrigan becoming Delia Oakes, and the cabin felt different after that. Warmer. Brighter. When the preacher left and the others followed, it was quiet again in the little room. Delia turned to him, uncertain. "Now what?" Xander reached out and took her hand. "Now we build something better. Together." And she smiled for the first time since he found her in the storm. By mid-January, the snow began to ease its grip on the land. The wind still cut sharp, but the days grew longer and the light softened along the ridge beyond Xander's cabin. Delia stepped outside most mornings now, wrapped in her wool shawl, her boots crunching over packed snow as she carried kindling from the stack near the lean-to. Her movements were careful but practiced, as if each task was a puzzle she was fitting herself into piece by piece. Xander watched from the barn door as she checked the hens, ran her palm over the frost-rimed sill, and adjusted the latch with a small frown. "That hinge is loose," she said as he approached, brushing her hands off on her apron. "It'll pull free come thaw if it's not seen to." "I'll fix it before sundown," he said, nodding. "You've got a sharp eye. I was raised in a house that never had enough hands. You learn to see what needs doing." She didn't smile, just stated it like a fact. That was something he liked about her. She didn't waste words trying to sound cheerful when she wasn't. But when she did smile, it felt earned. They walked together toward the barn, boots sinking slightly where the sun had softened the crust of snow. "You ever worked livestock?" he asked as they reached the gate. "Only chickens and a mule with a bad leg," she said. "I can learn the rest if you're willing to show me. I don't mind teaching, long as you don't mind getting dirty. I've been dirty since we left Ohio." He chuckled low in his throat, and she glanced at him, surprised by the sound. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and hide. The mare was heavy with foal, and Xander ran his hand along her flank. "She's due come April." Delia stepped closer, her gaze steady on the mare's side. "She's beautiful. What's her name?" "Don't name the animals," he said, almost absently. "Makes it harder if something goes wrong." Delia didn't press. She simply moved to the feed bin and began scooping oats into a pail, her sleeves rolled up to the elbow. "You ever think about what you'd do if you'd stayed back east?" he asked, leaning against the post. She kept her eyes on the scoop. "I'd have stayed in a boarding house run by a widow with an ill-tempered cat and too many rules. Found work hemming men's trousers or writing letters for the old. Spent Sundays in a pew and nights watching other girls marry." He didn't expect the bitterness in her tone, quiet but sharp. He tilted his head. "That sounds like a slow death. I left before it could finish me." They worked in silence after that. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one that felt like both of them were building something wordless between them. That night, after supper, Delia stood by the window sewing a new patch onto one of Xander's shirts. Her stitches were small and straight. The lamplight softened the angles of her face, and her hair, still damp from washing, hung in a thick braid over her shoulder. "You ever miss quiet?" she asked suddenly. Xander looked up from the ledger he kept near the hearth. "This place is nothing but quiet. I mean the kind that lives inside a person, not the kind outside your walls." He set down his pencil. "I reckon I knew that kind once. Before the war. Before the dying started." She didn't speak for a moment. "Then I used to sing. In church mostly. I haven't sung since Mama passed. I think that was the last time I felt quiet inside." Xander leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Sing now if you feel it." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet. Not till I mean it." He didn't press, just nodded once and picked up his pencil again. The next morning brought a wagon from the neighboring ranch. Clara and Elias Greeley had come to trade eggs and check on them. Clara tugged her shawl tight as she stepped down. "Word's out you married that mail-order girl," she said without preamble. Xander helped unload the sack of flour. "Her name's Delia. She seems steady? She's more than steady. Clara studied him a long moment. You don't talk much about your own. Nothing left to say. But I built a life from what was left of it. She's part of that now. Clara glanced toward the cabin. Then you'd best hold to her. Winter's only half over. Spring carries its own storms. Delia stepped out onto the porch just then, wiping her hands on her apron. She called a greeting, and Clara offered a nod of approval so subtle most would miss it. That night, after the Greeleys were gone and the chickens settled, Xander brought in a small wooden box from the barn. He set it on the table in front of Delia. "What's this?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Something I made years back. Figured it was time someone used it." He lifted the lid to reveal a set of carving tools, each handle worn smooth. "If you ever want to make something of your own." Her eyes traced the shape of the blades and something softened in her expression. "I didn't think I had anything left to make." "You do now," he said quietly. "You got all the time you need." And for the first time since they'd spoken vows, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Not out of thanks, but out of something quieter, something beginning to root deep. By early February, the land began to shift. Ice no longer groaned beneath every step, and the creek behind the ridge sang louder each morning. Xander had begun walking the fence line again, checking where posts leaned from the frost heave. Delia didn't ask to go with him, but she met him at the gate one morning with a wrapped biscuit and a clean rag for his hands. "I mended your gloves," she said, without looking up. Thread was near gone at the thumb. He took them from her, his fingers brushing hers. "I noticed. Thank you." She nodded once and turned back to the house. That night, she laid out a piece of pine across the table and began carving. Her hands were steady, her movements slow. She didn't speak as she worked, and Xander didn't ask what she was making. He watched the way her jaw tightened when she focused and the way her shoulders eased when she wiped the blade clean. When she finally looked up, it was late. The lamp's wick had burned low. "I think I need to write to my sister," she said. Xander set down the harness he had been oiling. "You never mentioned any family still living." "She's younger. Stayed behind. Married a man who runs a dry goods store. I think she thinks I'm dead. You want me to ride it into town? I'll take it myself when the thaw comes." He nodded. "You plan to tell her the truth?" Delia looked down at the wood in her hand. "I think I ought to. She'll want to know what kind of man you are." He raised a brow. "And what kind is that?" She set the carving knife down and met his eyes. "The kind a woman doesn't run from." Neither of them said anything after that. She folded the wood shavings into her palm and carried them to the fire. By the third week of the month, the mare went into labor. Xander stayed in the barn most of the night, and Delia brought him coffee twice. Wrapped in a shawl and boots he hadn't seen her wear before. She didn't speak, just handed him the tin cup and stood beside him, watching the animal strain. When the foal came, it was small and wet and trembling. Delia knelt beside the mare, her skirts soaking up the straw, and rubbed the colt's legs until it blinked and raised its head. "You should name him," Xander said, brushing straw from her hair. "I thought you didn't name animals." He shrugged. "I don't. But maybe you should." She looked at the colt. "Then I'll call him Ash, for how close he came to never burning bright." Xander didn't tell her it was a good name. He didn't need to. 2 days later, a letter arrived by Ryder. Xander met the courier halfway up the road, and when he returned, he held the envelope without speaking. Delia took it from him slowly. Her fingers trembled before she even read the name. "Do you know a man named Hiram Alden?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Yes. He's the one who sent for me." He waited. She opened the letter and read in silence. When she finished, she folded it once and set it on the table. "He married someone else. Said he believed me dead and grief made him foolish. He wanted to send money as if that could undo the rest." Xander didn't move. "Do you want to take it?" "No," she said. "I'm not his to pity." She walked to the hearth and dropped the letter into the fire. The flame curled it black. That night, she sat on the cot with her legs tucked beneath her, the carving in her lap. It had become a bird, wings folded in rest, the lines clean and certain. "I don't think I came here looking for a husband," she said, not lifting her eyes. "What do you think you came for? A place to be seen, not just used up and passed along." He stepped closer, slowly. "Do you feel seen here?" She looked up then, and her voice was quiet but clear. "I do." Xander knelt in front of her, hands resting on his thighs. "Delia, I never asked you what you wanted. Not really. I just offered what I had. I wanted to survive," she said. "Then I wanted stillness. Now I want to belong." "You do," he said. "You belong here as my wife, as yourself." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. "Then let it be real. Not just something we said over vows and paper." The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It was slow and warm and full of breath held too long. When it broke, she didn't pull away. Her hand stayed at his neck, her thumb brushing against the stubble along his jaw. Outside, the wind had gone still. Inside, something settled between them, not like a promise, but like a root finally catching hold of the earth. The thaw deepened into March. Mud gathered in the hollows near the barn, and the creek behind the ridge ran sharper, carrying winter's end down into the valley. Delia kept the windows open during the day now, letting in the clean scent of wet pine and thawed soil. She had begun to move with more certainty around the homestead, not out of obligation, but with the quiet rhythm of someone who'd claimed a place with her hands and kept it with her heart. Xander came in late one afternoon with a line of fish strung across his shoulder. He set them on the table and pulled off his coat. "That pond west of the ridges come back to life," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Trout are biting again." Delia looked over from the stove. "I've never gutted a fish." He picked up the smallest one. "I'll show you. Just don't flinch." "I didn't flinch when I helped pull a foal into the world," she said, stepping closer with a raised brow. "Fair enough," he murmured, and placed the fish on the cutting board. Her hands were steady as he guided her through the work, his voice low, his fingers brushing hers only when necessary. When they finished, she looked down at the cleaned fish lined up in the basin and nodded, satisfied. "That wasn't so awful," she said, "though I don't care for the smell." "Smell stays in your hands a while," he said, "but it cooks out good." She rinsed her palms and glanced toward the window. "I saw smoke this morning to the north, too close to be from town." "I saw it too," he said. "Could be the Greeley's clearing brush. I thought Clara said they wouldn't burn again till the ground dried." Xander paused, then wiped his blade clean. "You're right. I'll ride out tomorrow, make sure it's nothing gone wrong." She nodded but didn't look away from the window. "It's strange, not knowing who's close and who's not. We're not as alone as we sometimes feel. That's the truth of this land. Wide and empty until it's not." Delia turned back to the stove and laid the fish into the skillet. "I'd like to learn to shoot." Xander straightened. "You thinking of hunting?" "No. Just thinking I ought to know what to do if something ever comes through that door and means us harm." He studied her a long moment. "All right. We'll start tomorrow after I check that smoke." She nodded once, and they ate beside the fire that night with the windows still cracked open to the scent of pine smoke and damp earth. The next morning, Xander left at first light. Delia watched him ride over the ridge, the wind tugging at his coat. She spent the quiet hours mending a saddlebag that had torn near the stitching and sweeping the loft where the hay had begun to dry unevenly. By midday, she heard hoofbeats and stepped out onto the porch with her rifle cradled in both arms. But it wasn't Xander. A man on a chestnut gelding reined in at the gate. He wore a fine coat, too clean for trail work, and his boots shone even through the dust. His hair was slicked back beneath a gray hat, and his eyes flicked over her like she was something to be weighed. "You Mrs. Oakes?" he asked. "I am," she said, not lowering the rifle. "I'm looking for a man named Alden. Hiram Alden. He sent for a bride. Word in Fort Benton says she never arrived." Delia narrowed her eyes. "He sent for me, then married another before the thaw." The man nodded slowly. "Thought that might be the story. I'm his brother, Jeremiah." I came to find out if you were alive or buried beneath a snowdrift. You found your answer. There's nothing for you here. You sure about that? He asked, easing a hand down toward his saddlebag. Hiram left behind a deed. Land south of the pass. It was meant to go to you once you married. He's since changed his mind, but I figured I'd offer it direct. For a price. I've got no interest in anything Hiram Alden offers, she said, her voice steady. Not now. He gave her a long, unreadable look. Suit yourself. He turned his horse without another word and rode off slow like he wasn't in any hurry to leave the land. Xander returned near sundown, his coat dusted with ash. Greeley's lost a shed, he said, sliding from the saddle. Fire caught faster than they thought. Nobody hurt. Delia stepped off the porch and met him by the gate. You had a visitor. His gaze sharpened. Who? Jeremiah Alden. Hiram's brother. Xander's jaw set. What did he want? To trade me land Hiram was too ashamed to give. I told him no. Xander reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. You shouldn't have had to face that alone. I wasn't afraid. Not of him. He held her gaze. But you were prepared. I will always be, she said. For anything that comes. That night, as they readied for bed, Delia opened the chest at the foot of the cot and pulled out the carved bird. She set it on the windowsill, facing east. Xander looked over. That for something? She nodded. For tomorrow. For what we build next. He reached for her hand, and this time she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. The wind had quieted outside, and somewhere in the distance, the creek kept singing its thawing song. A gentle rain arrived with the first full week of April, soaking through the thawed ground and softening the air. Delia stood beneath the porch eave, watching the sky spill over the ridge. Her dress clung damp to her ankles, but she didn't mind. The land was waking. She could feel it in her chest, in the looseness of her breath. Xander stepped out beside her, holding a blanket. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. Rain's warm, she said. It is. He agreed. Won't last long. She turned her face toward him. When I was a girl, I used to run barefoot in spring rain. Mama would holler, but I always thought it felt like the earth forgiving itself. He studied her for a beat. You want to walk it again? She looked at him, surprised. Now? He stepped off the porch, boots sinking into soft mud, then turned with a quiet challenge in his eyes. You coming or not? She laughed, a sound that didn't carry weight or worry, and followed. They walked past the garden patch and the old fence line, water beating on their sleeves. Delia slipped her hand into his, and though the ground pulled at their boots, they moved easy, side by side. It's strange, she said after a while. I used to think my life would be a long line of things I had to endure. But here, I don't feel like I'm waiting for something to go wrong. He squeezed her hand gently. That's because you're not surviving anymore. You're living. They walked until the rain eased and the wind shifted south. The hills gleamed wet and new, and the brook farther down the slope sparkled where it ran clear. When they turned back toward the cabin, the chimney smoke rose steady into the sky. That evening, while Xander worked by lamplight over a new gate hinge, Delia opened the carved box and pulled out a folded scrap of cloth. She had been sewing it in quiet hours, the pieces coming together from worn shirts and old scraps tucked in the bottom of the trunk. It was a quilt square, shape stitched in deliberate patterns, nothing fancy, but made by her hands. She held it up. I've been thinking we ought to prepare a room. Xander looked up slowly. For what? For a child. He set down the hinge. I've missed 2 monthlies, she said. And I felt different. Tired, but not unwell. He stood quietly, crossing the room. You sure? I am. He reached for her, one hand resting on her waist, the other over her heart. You scared? A little. But not the way I used to be. This feels like it belongs here. His eyes didn't leave hers. Then we'll build that room. I'll clear the back corner of the loft. We'll need a cradle. I'll make one. She leaned into him, her voice soft. I never thought I'd bring a child into a world that felt safe. You are, he whispered, and we'll raise them in a place where love is the first thing they know. That night, they lay close beneath the stitched quilt she'd finished weeks ago, warmed not just by the fire but by the quiet certainty between them. Spring settled firm into the hills, and the cabin no longer felt like a place either of them had come to by accident. Through April and into May the land greened. She planted beans, squash, and turnips, her belly still flat but already changing in small, tender ways. Xander built the cradle from the maple near the creek. It had fallen in a storm years back and aged well in the barn. He carved the corners smooth and lined the inside with muslin she'd hemmed herself. Clara Greeley brought over a bundle of tiny shirts one afternoon, tied with twine and smelling faintly of cedar. "You'll want these," she said, setting them on the table. "They belong to my youngest." "Outgrown now." Delia touched the soft fabric. "Thank you." Clara's voice was quieter than usual when she said, "You two made something good out here. Not everyone manages that." Delia saw her to the door, then stood on the porch long after the wagon disappeared. That evening, when Xander came in from the field, she wrapped her arms around his waist and held him a moment longer than usual. "I don't want to name them after anyone lost," she said. "No ghosts," he agreed. "Only new beginnings." Summer came early, and so did the baby. A girl born in the same room where Delia had once been laid half-frozen. She arrived in the soft hush before sunrise, her cry thin but strong. Xander held her wrapped in linen, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You're home now." They named her Lark. Not for the bird, but for the way her cry welcomed the day. By autumn, the cabin had grown again, not in size, but in fullness. The cradle sat beside the hearth, and Lark kicked at the air with strong legs and a laugh that made the rafters echo. Xander added a second chair to the porch, and Delia planted a row of wildflowers along the edge of the path. One morning, as the first leaves turned gold, Delia sat in the rocker with Lark in her arms. Xander stood leaning in the doorway, watching them as if he still couldn't quite believe his life had turned this way. "You thinking something?" she asked. He crossed to her and knelt beside the chair. "I was thinking I've never known peace like this," he said. His hand brushed Lark's tiny foot. "And I don't ever want to forget how we got here." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines weathered by wind and time. "Then let's grow old in this house. Let's fill it with years." They sealed the promise with a kiss that held nothing undone between them. And as the sun rose over the ridge, gentle and sure, the three of them sat together in the warm light of a life fully built not from survival but from love.